true crime, Elizabeth Smart, the bedroom window, and the voice that changed everything. The search that refused to stop. The bedroom, the disguise, and the question that refused to leave. The window mattered before anyone understood why. Inside the Salt Lake City home, the first visible facts were small and terrible. A child's room, a sister awake in fear, a missing girl, and a cut in the ordinary safety of a family house. The first explanation was not enough. The first search was not enough. The first suspect was not enough. The life before the case. Before the case became a national shorthand, Elizabeth Smart was a child in a large Utah family with a life that could not be reduced to what happened to her. The public record has never needed to own every private detail of that life. What it does show is enough to matter. A 14-year-old girl in Salt Lake City, a family home, music, school, siblings, and the normal protections people assume around childhood. Elizabeth's own public biography later described her as a harp student who attended Brigham Young University after the case, studying music with a focus on harp performance. That later detail matters because it preserves continuity. The person at the center of the case was not created by the crime. She had interests, skill, education, family bonds, and a life on both sides of the event. That distinction is important in a case as famous as this one. Public memory often turns survivors into symbols. Symbols are easier to discuss than people. They are also easier to flatten. Elizabeth's story resists that. It begins inside ordinary life, not inside a case file. The violence of what followed was not only that she was taken. It was that a private human life was dragged into a public machinery of police searches, headlines, suspicion, witness memory, courtroom procedure, and eventually advocacy. That is why the bedroom window matters. It was not a cinematic symbol. It was the point where ordinary life stopped being ordinary. The people around them. The early case turned on people close to Elizabeth, people barely known to the family, and people whose names became attached to the investigation before the truth was clear. There were Elizabeth's parents, Ed and Lois Smart, whose home became the center of the search. There was Mary Catherine, Elizabeth's younger sister, who witnessed enough to know something had happened, but not enough, at first, to give police a clean identity. There were relatives, neighbors, volunteers, officers, and citizens who joined a search that grew far beyond one family. There was also a man the family had known briefly as Emmanuel. He had worked for the Smarts for a short time before the abduction. That connection did not immediately solve anything. At the time, it was one possible fragment among many. The public version of the case often moves too quickly from abduction to rescue. The real investigation was slower and messier. Authorities considered different possibilities. The family itself came under scrutiny. Another man, contractor Richard Ricci, became a focus of attention during the investigation before later developments moved the case elsewhere. Netflix's official documentary material notes that investigators looked at members of Elizabeth's family and at Ricci before Mary Catherine's later recollection became crucial. That early confusion is not a side detail. It is the shape of the case. There was a witness, but the witness was a frightened child. There was a missing girl, but little physical evidence that immediately pointed in one direction. There was a remembered presence, but not yet a proved identity. The social world around Elizabeth looked familiar. Then one remembered voice began to make it fragile. The first cracks. The first cracks were not clean evidence. They were impressions. Mary Catherine had heard the intruder. She had survived the terrifying experience of being in the same room while her sister was taken. A child's witness memory can be powerful, but it can also be incomplete, delayed, and shaped by fear. In this case, that delay would become one of the most important facts in the investigation. The man known as Emmanuel did not immediately stand at the center of the official search. The family had encountered him before, but briefly. He was not someone whose role made immediate sense as the answer to the crime. That is one reason the case took the route it did. The eventual answer was close enough to be remembered, but strange enough to be missed. The early investigation also had to deal with the hard limits of the scene. A bedroom can show entry. It does not always show identity. A witness can describe a voice. She may not be able to name it at once. A family can sense that something is wrong, but suspicion is not proof. That was the first legal and investigative lesson of the Elizabeth Smart case. The truth can be present before it is usable. The public saw a missing child case. Investigators saw a field of possibilities. The family saw the unbearable gap between what they feared and what they could establish. The first crack in the case did not come from a forensic breakthrough. It came from memory, returning slowly. The last ordinary movements of the case belonged to a house at night. Elizabeth was inside her family home. Mary Catherine was nearby. The room was not a remote road, a public park, or a place that obviously invited danger. That is part of why the case struck so deeply. The setting challenged one of the most basic assumptions about safety: that a child asleep at home is protected by walls, family, and routine. The abductor entered during the early hours. The official documentary description says Elizabeth was taken from her bedroom at knife point, while Mary Catherine witnessed the event. The important point is not the weapon as spectacle. It is the control it created. A child was forced into compliance, while another child remained frozen with fear. At that stage, the case had not yet become a trial, a documentary, or a public lesson about survivor advocacy. It was still a narrow sequence of actions: entry, threat, removal, silence. The room left behind did not explain the motive. It did not identify the person. It did not show where Elizabeth had been taken. It only confirmed that the first explanation could not be simple. Some crimes begin with a body, a weapon, or a confession. This one began with a missing child, and a witness who had to carry a memory before she could fully use it. The last ordinary detail was the idea that a bedroom was safe. The first alarm. The first alarm was not a siren. It was a child telling adults what had happened. Mary Catherine's role in the case should not be treated as a neat plot device. She was a young witness in a terrifying moment, and her later importance does not erase what the first hours must have been: fear, confusion, disbelief, and the awful difficulty of turning a child's account into an actionable police lead. Once Elizabeth was reported missing, the case widened quickly. Police had to consider forced abduction, family involvement, a possible runaway theory, accidental explanations, and people who had been near the family. The public, seeing only fragments, often wants immediate certainty. Investigations rarely work that way. There was an early gap between fear and proof. That gap shaped everything. If police moved too narrowly, they risked missing the answer. If they moved too broadly, they risked exhausting time and attention. The case also developed during a period when child abduction alerts were becoming a national policy issue in the United States. The federal Amber Alert system was still evolving, and the Elizabeth Smart case became part of the public conversation about how quickly communities, broadcasters, law enforcement, and citizens should move when a child is believed to be in danger. A later federal summary said Smart had been abducted at 14, had been missing for 9 months, and was found about 18 miles from home. That distance is haunting, because it was both far and close. She was not on another continent. She was not lost beyond imagination. She was near enough for the search to feel painfully possible, and hidden enough that possibility did not become rescue. The search for an explanation. The search for Elizabeth Smart became one of the most followed child abduction cases of its time. Her own public biography uses that phrase, and it is not an exaggeration. The case drew national attention because it joined several fears at once: a child taken from home, a witness too young to give an immediate full answer, and an investigation with no quick resolution. Theories formed because people needed the absence to mean something. Maybe someone close had been involved. Maybe a known worker had knowledge of the house. Maybe the answer lay with Richard Ricci, whose name became publicly tied to suspicion before later evidence, and events changed the direction. Maybe Elizabeth had been moved far away. Maybe the case would never produce a living answer. The public often remembers the eventual solution, and then judges the early investigation through hindsight. That is too simple. At the time, investigators had to separate resemblance from proof, rumor from evidence, and grief from leads. What made the search especially difficult was that Elizabeth was alive, but controlled. She was not simply hidden in one fixed place. She was disguised, threatened, and made to understand that escape could carry danger for herself and her family. Elizabeth's own biography later described that her captors controlled her by threatening to kill her and her family if she tried to escape. That fact changes how the public should understand the case. Survival under coercion does not always look like running, shouting, or fighting in the way outsiders imagine. Sometimes survival means waiting, reading danger, obeying enough to remain alive, and holding on to the possibility of a moment that has not yet arrived. The first explanation failed, because the case was not only about where Elizabeth was, it was about how control can make a living person invisible. The evidence that did not fit. The evidence that eventually mattered most was not dramatic in the usual way. It was a voice. Mary Catherine later connected the intruder's voice to the man the family had known as Emmanuel. That recollection changed the direction of the case, because it created a bridge between the bedroom and a real person. It did not automatically prove everything. It gave investigators and the family a sharper place to look. The family pushed for a sketch connected to Emmanuel. Once the image and story moved into wider public circulation, the case entered a different phase. It was no longer only a missing child search. It became a recognition problem. Had anyone seen this man, and was he connected to the missing girl? That is the force of the Elizabeth Smart case as an investigative lesson. The breakthrough was not a single miracle. It was accumulation, a witness memory, family insistence, a sketch, media exposure, public attention, and citizens willing to act on what they recognized. The public version often compresses this into one line. The sister remembered. The fuller version is more useful. A memory became actionable only when it was translated into an image, circulated, recognized, and taken seriously. That is also where the case corrected an assumption. People often imagine that police evidence must be technical to matter: DNA, fingerprints, phone records, location data. Here, the critical human evidence was older and simpler. A child heard a voice. Months later, that voice found a name. The window showed entry. The voice began to show identity. The event at the center of the case. The central event was not one moment. It was a sequence of coercion that began in a bedroom and continued for 9 months. Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee later became the names attached to the legal outcome. Mitchell was the man who took Elizabeth from the home. Barzee was his wife and accomplice. Federal records later show that Barzee pleaded guilty to kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor, and that prosecutors agreed to a 15-year sentence in exchange for her full and truthful cooperation in Mitchell's prosecution. The violence in this case must be described carefully. Elizabeth was a child. The abuse was sexual, physical, psychological, and religiously framed. Her foundation later summarized that she endured 9 months of sexual assault, starvation, and abuse at the hands of her captors. That is enough detail to understand the legal and human gravity, without turning the abuse into spectacle. Mitchell used threats to control her. Barzee's role mattered because she did not function as a passive bystander in the legal record. Her guilty plea and stipulated conduct made her part of the criminal responsibility for the abduction and transportation. The case was not legally framed as one man acting alone, while one woman merely existed nearby. The evidence also showed the limits of outside judgment. Elizabeth was seen in public during captivity, but disguise, fear, threats, and coercive control made recognition difficult. Outsiders later asked why she did not simply identify herself. That question misunderstands the situation. A child under threat is not operating inside ordinary freedom. The public version often looks for the single moment Elizabeth could have escaped. The more serious reading asks what made escape dangerous, what made speech unsafe, and how a captor's control can survive even in open space. The abuse was not only what Mitchell did. It was the system of fear that made Elizabeth's identity harder to speak aloud. When the story broke open. The story broke open because ordinary citizens looked twice. By March 12, 2003, the case had been unresolved for 9 months. Elizabeth's public biography says police safely returned her to her family that day after she had been held prisoner for 9 months. Federal material later noted that she was found about 18 miles from home. The rescue depended on recognition. The image associated with Emmanuel had circulated. People saw Mitchell in public with Barzee and a disguised girl. They connected what they saw to what had been shown and reported. That was the moment the case shifted from missing person uncertainty to recovery. Elizabeth's foundation later credited public awareness and a watchful community in Salt Lake City with helping identify her so she could return home. That statement is important because it avoids making the rescue feel automatic. It was not automatic. It required citizens to act, police to respond, and Elizabeth to be separated from the people controlling her. The disguise mattered because it showed how close the case could come to being missed. A person can be visible and still not be seen. A survivor can be in public and still not be free. When the story broke open, the public got the outcome it had hoped for. Elizabeth was alive. But rescue was not the end of the case. It was the beginning of a longer legal and personal process. The search had answered one question. It had not yet answered what accountability would require. The case built from fragments. The legal case against Mitchell took years to reach trial because competency became a major issue. In March 2010, a federal judge found Mitchell competent to stand trial. The U.S. Attorney's Office described that ruling as a significant step toward accountability, after years of waiting for Elizabeth, her family, and the community. The same federal statement also emphasized a basic legal safeguard. Defendants are presumed innocent unless or until proven guilty in court. That legal safeguard matters, even in a case where public emotion was intense. The court was not being asked whether the country believed Elizabeth. It was being asked whether the government could prove federal crimes beyond the required legal standard, and whether Mitchell could be tried. The charges were federal, interstate kidnapping, and unlawful transportation of a minor. Those charges mattered because Elizabeth had been moved across state lines during the period of captivity. The legal question was not simply whether she had been taken. It was whether the government could prove the specific elements of federal crimes tied to kidnapping and transport. Barzee's plea simplified one part of the case, but did not eliminate the need to try Mitchell. Her agreement required cooperation. Prosecutors framed the plea as a way to avoid forcing Elizabeth to testify against Barzee, while preserving Barzee's obligation to assist in the prosecution of Mitchell. The evidence was built from witness memory, survivor testimony, the history of contact with the family, the circumstances of captivity, interstate movement, and the conduct of both captors. It was not a forensic mystery in the modern television sense. It was a case about identity, coercion, capacity, and proof. The public had already reached its emotional conclusion. The court still had to do its work. The outcome that did not end the story. Mitchell was convicted after a 4-week federal jury trial. In May 2011, U.S. District Judge Dale Kimball sentenced him to life in federal prison for the June 2002 abduction of Elizabeth Smart. The federal release said Mitchell had been convicted of interstate kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor. Federal prosecutors had asked for a life sentence. Their sentencing position, quoted in the official release, argued that Mitchell's history, character, refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing, and danger to children made release unacceptable. That outcome had a clear legal meaning. Mitchell was no longer a suspect, person of interest, or accused person. He was a convicted federal prisoner, serving a life sentence. Barzee, by contrast, had resolved her federal case through a guilty plea and a 15-year sentence agreement. Legal closure did not mean emotional simplicity. Elizabeth had survived. Her captors had been prosecuted. But the public process required her to revisit the case in court, to testify, and to have private harm translated into legal language. That translation is necessary in criminal justice. It is also incomplete. A verdict can decide guilt. It cannot restore the childhood that was interrupted. A sentence can protect the public from one offender. It cannot remove the memory of the window, the threats, the disguise, or the months in which a child had to survive through calculation. The law reached an answer. Elizabeth still had to build a life beyond it. The aftermath, people still argue about. The most debated aftermath has centered on Wanda Barzee's release and later conduct. Barzee was released from prison in 2018, after authorities credited time served, a decision that shocked and angered Elizabeth Smart and many who followed the case. Later, in 2025, the Elizabeth Smart Foundation issued a statement after Barzee entered Salt Lake City public parks, despite being legally barred because of her status as a registered sex offender. The foundation said Barzee's reported justification that she was commanded by the Lord raised concern because of the role religious language had played in the original abuse. That statement is not just a reaction to one incident. It shows why the case still feels unfinished to many survivors and advocates. A sentence can expire. Supervision rules can be technical. Risk can be argued through statutes, treatment records, and conditions of release. Survivors, however, often experience the same facts differently. They hear old language return and see danger where the system sees a violation category. This is where the Elizabeth Smart case becomes broader than one prosecution. It raises questions about how systems monitor convicted offenders after release, how survivor concerns are weighed, and how legal completion can differ from public safety anxiety. The foundation's statement thanked Salt Lake City Police for their handling of the incident and framed it as a reminder that systems should center survivors, enforce registry rules, and evaluate people convicted of crimes like Barzee's. The argument people still have is not whether Elizabeth survived. She did. It is whether the systems built around cases like this can understand survival as more than a legal endpoint. The review, appeal, or unanswered question. The unanswered question in the Elizabeth Smart case is not who committed the abduction. The courts answered that. The harder question is what the public learned from the case, and what it still misunderstands. One common misunderstanding is that Elizabeth's rescue proves public recognition systems work automatically. They do not. They require the right information to reach the right people at the right time. And they require citizens to trust their own concern enough to act. Another misunderstanding is that survival under coercive control should look obvious from the outside. It rarely does. Elizabeth was disguised. She was threatened. She was a child. She had been told that speaking or escaping could bring violence onto her and her family. Those facts do not make her silence strange. They make it comprehensible. The case also sits inside the broader development of child abduction response. Federal material on Amber Alert development explains that Amber Alerts are emergency broadcasts issued when law enforcement determines a child has been abducted and is in imminent danger, and that the PROTECT Act, signed in April 2003, established the National Amber Alert Coordinator role. Elizabeth later became an advocate connected to child abduction, recovery programs, the National Amber Alert, the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act, and other safety legislation. Her public biography also notes her work on a Department of Justice Survivor's Guide, intended to help recovered children understand that hope and a rewarding life remain possible. That is the part of the case that cannot be captured by the word rescue. Rescue returned Elizabeth to her family. Advocacy turned survival into public work. Why this case still matters. The Elizabeth Smart case still matters because it forces several uncomfortable distinctions. It separates being visible from being safe. It separates being found from being healed. It separates legal closure from survivor confidence. It separates public suspicion from courtroom proof. It separates the fantasy of a perfect rescue system from the real work of recognition, response, prevention, and long-term support. The case also changed how many people talk about survivors. Elizabeth's later advocacy challenged the damaging idea that sexual violence destroys a person's worth or future. Her work has repeatedly pushed public attention toward recovery, education, prevention, and survivor dignity, rather than spectacle. The Elizabeth Smart Foundation was founded in 2011 to bring hope and help end sexual assault and abuse through prevention, healing, and advocacy. In 2022, it became part of the Maloof Foundation to broaden that work. That legacy matters because true crime can easily become a machine that consumes victims and survivors as content. Elizabeth Smart's public life pushes in the opposite direction. It insists that survival is not the end of the person's story, and that the worst thing that happened to someone does not own everything that comes after. The bedroom window remains the opening image because it still holds the case's central lesson. Safety failed there. Memory began there. The first usable clue was carried by a child who heard a voice, and later found the courage, language, and recognition to name what she knew. In the beginning, the window showed only that someone had entered. By the end, the case showed something larger. Sometimes the truth is close, visible, and still almost missed.